I was recently confronted with the most basic question, which did again stump me more than it should at this stage of my watch hobby. Why vintage? First of all, I do not limit myself artificially to older timepieces, but I do seem to prefer vintage or non-modern watch models 9 out of 10 times. As a disclaimer, I will include some watches in my line of thought which are just 10 years or older. Proper vintage starts at maybe 30 years old, but there is no exact definition anyway. There's a plethora of YouTube uploads trying to justify the pros and cons, but they rarely fit my own collecting journey. So here it is, my take on the typical statements as a vintage watch worshipper for over 2 decades. Probably the most obvious statement first. Vintage watches have a history, and with that we mostly refer to the models or the watch lines past, but the specific item in hand has its own history as well, of course. Thus, I need to start out with a con here, because I think the majority of non-watch geeks feels that way. New means shiny, and if you dumb down vintage on the other hand to pre-owned, which you shouldn't I think, the fact that some other nobody wore the watch before does not really add to your own experience, right? And with this view of just having a worn item, you end up on the negative side of a discussion almost immediately. And I partially agree. I do wish to dissuade my discussion partner, but in reality, even though most pre-owned arrive clean at my door, you need to be at least ready to have your own watch cleaning equipment, because some eBay sellers do not seem to care about the slightest level of hygiene when sending off your new timepiece. So that's definitely a con. That being said, it's the exception rather than the norm, fortunately. But dents and scratches is where watch enthusiasts are indeed divided. Could you live with them? Do they even add to the style as part of the patina, or is it out of the question entirely for you? Personally, vintage means gracefully aged rather than just pre-owned. Anyway, a scratch here and there is unavoidable, but also a testament to the fact that this watch was worn and enjoyed by someone. And the most important part, it is a watch that was worthy of being kept. An item which used to be even more respected and useful in a bygone era, without affordable digital counterparts, even though I'd consider those totally worthy vintage material as well, but certainly a time without smartphones. It's not just a reissue which tries to hark back to some glorious past, but it is the exact memento that someone cherished for many years, and it happens to now be part of your humble collection. Definitely a pro, and something a new model can never truly deliver on like the original vintage. Which is a perfect segue to talk about originality. A tough topic since replacement parts are just not available for some models anymore, and therefore you either keep a completely time-worn or even destroyed dial, or switch it out for an aftermarket one. Everything else might be still original on your watch, but it is up to the person wearing the watch to define the boundaries of original and vintage for themselves. But it is definitely not a matter of opinion when it comes to selling such an aftermarket parts watch. Please be honest. Doesn't matter if you're a professional or a private seller. Dishonesty is the main killer of ambitions towards vintage for anyone new to that particular branch of the watch world. And it just sucks to find out your vintage deal is not what it seems in its entirety. I will add a question mark to this though, because fraudsters are not exclusive to vintage watches, and having aftermarket parts is basically a necessity to keep some of our favorite models alive in the first place. Now, these were already complex items on the list, so let's continue with one that is quicker to answer, and a topic which I usually hate: the value of a watch, meaning the monetary one. First of all, we're talking about basically superfluous items in our day and age. So this is a fling rather than an investment, and I hope we're on the same page here as an enthusiast. This is true for most vintage watches the same way as for modern ones. Only very few models keep their value and even less turn you a profit, which in return means that all those models with plummeting prices already may very well have that stage behind them when you buy them pre-owned/vintage. To give you an example, if someone hates on that new release by brand X to only have a third-party movement or look so weird, well, those are the watches you could pick up cheap later on when the market finally decided its mainstream worth. So it quickly becomes a question if you like the things anyone likes, which can also make vintage watches very pricey, of course, or if you have a distinct taste, which I guess is true if you watch this channel, and enjoy something more off the beaten path. If the latter is truly the case, then have at it. There are bargains to be made, even for more well-known brands and amazing specifications. However, a good vintage watch does not have to be expensive or carry a certain brand. I guess it's even safe to say that the frequency of fraudulent offerings is lower for an affordable vintage piece from an unknown brand than it is for the all-famous ones. But unknown service history though, the bane of all that I just said. Same with used cars. What if your first TiMEworn endeavor just does not work properly? Buy the seller is what you hear first and foremost. And it is solid advice. A professional vintage dealer showing you that the watch works and that it has received its last service just days or weeks ago is the optimal way to go, especially for a first-time pre-owned buy. But, and that's what I want to point out, check your options as well. For example, the more I looked on eBay for affordable, funky 70s chronos that suited my tastes, the more I found which were powered by the same robust hand-wound movement, the Valjoux 7734. And I cannot guarantee it, but I bet there is a watchmaker at least within your country and within reach of your postal service that knows how to fix and maintain that simple and robust movement for a reasonable price. Get in touch with him and stake out the possible additional costs if a watch offer might be cheap, but you have some reservations about its state and want to factor in maintenance before submitting your final price. And you can always check out the internet about the possible pitfalls of a specific watch or movement. Servicing in general is a topic where I deviate greatly from all those advices online. Most of them cite a 2 to 5 year servicing interval as mandatory, especially with vintage pieces. But to be frank, this is a very conservative approach. I only send in a watch for service if I have a feeling it is running sluggish or showed signs like decreased power reserve, etc., which resulted in my overall average servicing interval going more towards 10 years and above. This does not mean that I am doing the right thing, by the way, and that a watchmaker would agree to this, but I wanted to share my experience here. Which leads me to, definitely do your own thing in this hobby. If you enjoy the luxurious atmosphere of a dealer and their range of modern, scratch-free models, peeling off stickers and all that, that's great. And I do love me some newfangled horological innovations myself. New does by no means equal bad. But on the other side, if you feel like falling for that whole watch thing permanently, it is definitely worth it to have a look at some older versions of the models you're into. Maybe the correct size of it you really wanted was already released a decade ago. Explore what that brand offered 30 years ago and maybe have a look for other legendary brands that just didn't make it during the quartz crisis. If you decide to go for older watch models, you are independent of trends and your range of available variations, for example, case shapes, dial colors, functionalities, styles, and also price spectrum, just instantly broadens, even to a point where it can get overwhelming. Most videos show you the same very vintagey style of 50s, 60s watches when discussing this topic, while I'm leaning more towards the expressive versions of the 70s. So there definitely is more than meets the eye at first glance. I can still vividly remember when I first saw a Wittenauer or heard of the brand name Aquadive or Enicar and just kept losing myself in the design and history for weeks and months. Also, don't worry about finding the correct size for your wrist with older watches. Smaller sizes are ubiquitous within the vintage watch world, but also larger sized models were already available, for example in the 60s, even though we couldn't consider 40mm jumbo anymore in this day and age. But the 70s especially had their fair share of chunkier offerings. I pondered about adding research necessary as a con, but I would like to keep it off the list. You can research a lot about a vintage piece to fully grasp its significance, etc., but you're always free to just enjoy the design and take the price, given that everything works as advertised, at face value. If you like that Heuer on offer on eBay or anywhere else and do not care if it has aftermarket parts but are willing to fork out the price for just the aesthetics, it is definitely a thing to enjoy. Just like you don't have to know if that new watch truly has an in-house movement or if it lied being the brand to release the first waterproof watch to be happy with it. But I must recommend doing your own research. In conclusion, a lot of positives and negatives that exist for new watches can just be transferred onto the vintage watch world as well. But I think you can never replace that tiny piece of sentimentality or nostalgia and connection to watch history itself that comes on top with a time-worn piece. Also, if the hunt is a factor for your enjoyment of this hobby, finding that perfect condition of a specific decade-old model, which might have been already rare back then, represents a superior feeling of a successful hunt than any authorized dealer of a new release can ever provide. But I guess now I stopped being impartial there. So to me, it's not a matter of becoming an all-vintage hermit who avoids anything less than 10 years old, but it is the fact of expanding the journey or opening up to that gigantic world that offers so much more to talk about than any new trendy piece can provide. What do you think about vintage or this list? Thanks to each and everyone who ventures with me into the weird and wonderful of the vintage watch world. See you in the next one on the TiMEworn channel.